Brothers and sisters, we would like to begin the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran by Khadija Ghulam. So please welcome her with la salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
It's okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها وكلوا من رزقه وإليه النشور. أأمنتم من في السماء أن يخسف بكم الأرض فإذا هي تمور أم أمنتم من في السماء أن يرسل عليكم حاصبا فستعلمون كيف نذير. ولقد كذب الذين من قبلهم فكيف كان نكير. أولم يروا إلى الطير فوقهم صافات ويقبضن ما يمسكهن إلا الرحمن إنه بكل شيء بصير. أمن هذا الذي هو جند لكم ينصركم من دون الرحمن إن الكافرون إلا في غرور. أمن هذا الذي يرزقكم إن أمسك رزقه بل لجوا في عتو ونفور. أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم. قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. قل هو الذي ذرأكم في الأرض وإليه تحشرون. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين. قل إنما العلم عند الله وإنما أنا نذير مبين. فلما رأوه زلفة سيئت وجوه الذين كفروا وقيل هذا الذي كنتم به تدعون. قل أرأيتم من أهلكني الله ومن معي أو رحمنا فمن يجير الكافرين من عذاب أليم. قل هو الرحمن آمنا به وعليه توكلنا فستعلمون من هو في ضلال مبين. قل أرأيتم إن أصبح ماؤكم غورا فمن يأتكم بماء معين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
اللهم صل على Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Thank you very much, Khadija. Brothers and sisters, the next part of the program is the main talk by Tharik Hussain. Please welcome him with al salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Tharik Hussain is an award-winning author, historian, a travel writer, and the fellow at the Center of Religion and Heritage at the University of Groningen in Netherlands. He specializes in Muslim heritage and culture. His new book, Muslim Europe, A Journey in Search of a 1400 Years History, was published on the 20th of November, and it was described by William Dalrymple as a book that nudges us to remember the massive debt that Europe still owes the Muslim world. He's also an author of several travel guides for Lonely Planet, including Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Thailand, London, and Great Britain. Please welcome him with la salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, firstly, to Mikdad Bhai for arranging this and inviting me over. It's actually my second talk for the centre. I think the last time was during COVID, so we had to do it online, and it was a real pleasure, but this is so much nicer than staring at a screen full of people. So I'm going to begin by offering a quick overview of what you can expect over the next half hour or so. I'll begin by offering you some insight into the thinking behind the new book and the context around it, why I wrote it, and what I hope to achieve with it. I'll then talk you through the route I took to write the book and my methodological approach, again, explaining the thinking behind these decisions before taking you on a bit of a whirlwind journey to the places in the book, but focusing on the things I came upon in those places maybe that are a little lesser known. But before I do that, I have a little giveaway that I always do at these talks. So this is just really to kind of get people engaging with the book, because as you know, in this day and age, us authors, this is the way in which people know about our work, and word of mouth is always much more effective than me begging people to buy the book. So over the next 24 hours, if anybody that is a bit of a social media, whiz, and I'm sure there are several in here, even if you don't want to admit that, I will then pick out somebody's post from my Instagram. There's the tags that you use, so if you need to take a picture, but if you look me up, you'll find me anyway. And then I'll send you a copy, but it'll be a special one with a gilded gold stamp on it, not one that you can just buy off some random stall here. So that's just something, if you're into those kind of things, just tag me at Tharik_Hussain, and obviously tag the centre as well. And yeah, I'll get back to you in the next 24 hours. Thank you. Now, I always thought this was going to be my first major corrective piece of work, as in the Orange Book. I thought this was the book where I was going to try and offer up the hidden Muslim history of Europe that I kept stumbling upon, and talk about how significant it was in shaping our modern cultures today. But it wasn't. As many of you who tuned into that talk all those years ago know, that was my book, Minarets in the Mountains. And the reason for that, of course, is because Minarets covers a region of Europe that is actually home to 3 Muslim countries and millions of indigenous European Muslims. In other words, I realized by presenting the living proof of Europe's indigenous Muslims, those still of the opinion that Muslims are foreign and alien to the continent would find it very difficult to continue arguing this. But of course they do. And later, I will show you one of the main ways in which this is achieved. Muslim Europe then, the Orange Book, was about going right back to the beginning. Firstly, to show just how long Muslims have been European, and crucially, how significant we have been in constructing what we might call modern Europe, thus to challenge what is now the widely accepted notion that Europe is a Judeo-Christian construct. More on that later. And to try and make clear that actually it is Abrahamic. The other reason I wrote the book was the urgency I was beginning to feel. The more I began looking into the rise of anti-Muslim hate and Islamophobia, of course, they're two very different things, the more I began to appreciate the roots of this worrying phenomenon. Which is why in this book, I delve a little deeper into the roots of Europe's anti-Muslimness. Something that makes this book maybe just a little more uncomfortable to read, as it is no longer just about the excitement and novelty, as the first book was, of a Muslim showing you Muslim Europe. In this book, I also begin unpicking why Muslim Europe and its history has remained hidden for so long, and more worryingly, the impact this has had on all of us. A quick audit of popular history books of Europe make it clear one of the reasons is the continued negligence and omission of Europe's 1400-year Muslim history by modern historians. Omissions that reinforce the growing claim by the far right that Muslims are foreign and alien to Europe, always have been, and therefore always will. In other words, we are incompatible when it comes to Europe. A narrative repeated, as I show in the book, across Europe, continuing to fuel the terrifying rise in anti-Muslim hate. I know that many of us come across snippets almost daily now in our social media echo chambers about this hidden piece of Islamic history here and that piece over there. And briefly, we're very excited, maybe experiencing pride, a sense of injustice as to why it remains hidden. But then, like most things on social media, we swipe and we move on to the next fleeting moment on our screens, and nothing really changes. There's no denying that the advent of the digital age and the impact of social media has helped to raise awareness of alternative and wider takes on traditionally accepted histories and narratives. And many of us have even gone off to places maybe like Granada and Cordoba and marveled at the surviving monuments to this history. But all too often, even these experiences and revelations are atomistic and detached for various reasons. They don't really tell the whole story, and they certainly don't put them into the wider context of Europe or the other seemingly detached early Muslim presences in places like Portugal, Sicily, and Cyprus. And so to my journey. The route I took begins in Cyprus, at the very edge of what we now call Europe, and slowly makes its way westward, just like the early Muslims did. I go from Cyprus to Sicily, followed by Malta, Portugal, and then finally Spain. I do this firstly to tell the more accurate chronology of the Muslim arrival in Europe and make clear where we actually first made our presence felt. Why and how the various moments that led to that early culture that so revolutionized the place we now call Europe are connected and were part of what the historian Al-Maqdisi called a province. Although I focus on modern-day Europe, I make clear in the book how that province included parts of North Africa, all of which were, of course, part of the wider Muslim Commonwealth that stretched all the way east. As those who have read my first book will know, one of the key methodological approaches I use to help readers better appreciate this history and heritage is by discussing it as what might be termed as an insider. In other words, I do so primarily through Muslim lens to present what I call a European Muslim-centric version of this history. I do this to try and get away from the post-Christian, white, Western takes of this history that have become the dominant versions. These, up until now, have at best presented the Muslim presence, contribution, and history as foreign, alien, and not of Europe, or simply ignored it. Thus, in this book, I rely heavily on historic Muslim travelers, writers, pilgrims, and historians like Ibn Jubair, Ibn Hawqal, Al-Harawi, and Al-Makkari. And now I will take you on a journey through some of the places and spaces I visited to offer you a glimpse of just how different that history and narrative can look when appreciated in this way and through such lens. We begin in Cyprus, or what was known to the Muslims as Qubrus, where Muslim Europe really does start. And for whatever reason, this has been thoroughly underappreciated, not just by traditional Western historians who often talk about this presence being some kind of Arab raids when discussing the almost 3 centuries long Muslim presence there, as if they were just insignificant incidents. In this book, I wanted to rectify this and reposition Qubrus's pivotal role in the narrative of Muslim Europe. You see, up until the middle of the 7th century, the great Muslim expansion out of Arabia had been overland, as Persian and Byzantine territories were taken at a rapid pace. To continue expanding west at this point, the Muslims would need to take to sea, something they had never done up to this point, and might not have for quite some time had it not been for the tenacity of the then local governor of Shams or Syria, Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, whose ambitious nature led him to seek the Caliph's permission to build a navy and take Qubrus, which was being used as a strategic naval base by the Byzantines. Muawiyah approaches Khalif Omar, bemoaning how the Byzantines are constantly raiding his coastal towns, and that they are so close he can even hear their dogs barking from the shore. But Omar, after consulting his governor in Egypt, isn't interested and shuts this down. The ambitious Muawiyah wasn't about to give up, and when his cousin Uthman is appointed Khalif, he tries again, hoping familial ties would offer leverage, and they do, because after some consideration, Uthman agrees and gives permission for Muawiyah. And the significance of this moment really does get overlooked by our historians, because he goes and builds the very first Muslim navy. This is a huge moment because it paves the way for eventual Muslim naval supremacy in the region. As a result, Muslims land in Qubrus between 647 and 649 to take the island and turn it into a garrison. That's within 15 years or so of the Prophet ﷺ dying. This means many members of the first generation of Muslims and their successors, in other words, the most revered 3 generations of Muslims, became European. And here we can see one of the 3 sites that are reputedly the final resting place of some of the Sahaba that made it to Qubrus. There are 3 such sites in Cyprus today, and a number of others said to have links back to that first Muslim period, including mosques believed to have been built on the site of early ones. Those early mosques built in Qubrus would have been the very first European mosques. Of course, the most famous site in Cyprus is this, the Hala Sultan Mosque and Tekke in Larnaca in the south of the island. And if you can't see it there, it's right in the middle of the new book. This is the mosque on the cover, and where the story of Muslim Europe, and in many ways, my own personal journey in search of it, really begins. You see, the Hala in the name is taken from the Arabic Khala, to mean aunt, because it is believed the tomb next to this mosque is that of Haram, an actual aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, whose death on foreign shores was prophesied by the Prophet and appears in several hadiths, including those found in the most revered Sunni collection of all, Sahih al-Bukhari. As a result, throughout history, medieval sources like Al-Harawi, who authored a kind of medieval pilgrim's guide for Muslims, tells us that Qubrus became a site of ziyarah, or pilgrimage. And for some Muslims, especially those in Cyprus, it became one of the most revered sites of pilgrimage in the world. So significant that when the Ottoman Navy would pass Larnaca, they would perform a gun salute. So already we can see the importance of Qubrus to the Muslim European narrative. By arriving within just a few decades of the birth of Islam, you could say Muslims became European quicker than Christians or Jews. Then there is the fact that the island is the burial site of actual Sahaba, making it, of course, a significant place of ziyarah even today. The other reason Cyprus is significant today is that it is home to a distinctly European Sufi order. The Naqshbandi Haqqani, whose founder, the late Sheikh Muhammad Nazim Adil al-Kubrusi al-Haqqani, is also linked to each of these sacred sites, having spent years campaigning for them to be reopened for Muslim ziyarah and usage. Sheikh Nazim, who was born in Larnaca and whose grandfather was the Hodja at the Hala Sultan Mosque, is also an example of an indigenous European Muslim Sufi sheikh. And with his order, he offers living proof that the ancient European mystical traditions I discuss in the book, observed by the likes of Ibn Arabi, amongst others, remains very much alive. And that's his son, Adil, Sheikh Adil, who's taken over there. That said, probably the most underrated aspect of the Qubrus moment, as I alluded to earlier, is the establishment of a Muslim navy, led by the ambitious Muawiyah, who of course was not content with just taking Qubrus. He began picking off more and more of what are now the Greek islands in the region, and became so confident that he quickly developed ambitions of attacking the capital of Byzantium itself, Constantinople. Such were the naval successes of the Muslims at this point that the Byzantine emperor himself decided to bring his huge fleet and meet this irritating new upstart at what became known as the Battle of the Mars. Arriving with more than twice the number of ships as the Muslims, Emperor Constans II led the fleet, expecting to quickly extinguish the young pretenders. But instead, they were routed. And Constans is said to have escaped by the skin of his teeth, fleeing disguised as a common sailor. As you can imagine, the victory meant only one thing. However, just as plans were being laid to send an armada to Constantinople, Muawiyah's cousin, the Caliph Uthman, was murdered, leading to a civil war amongst the Muslims, and Muawiyah is called back to Arabia. When he returns, he is now the Caliph of the Sunnis and has moved his capital to Damascus, picking up from where he left off, launching further campaigns on Byzantine territories, including around 674, one on the city of Constantinople itself. Muawiyah's navy lays siege to the city for 2 years, and the only reason they are not able to capture it is down to an ancient and mysterious weapon known as Greek fire, a kind of ancient napalm that continues to burn in water. Although the attempt on Byzantium fails, by the time of his death, 2 years later, what Muawiyah has done is take control of the Bahar al-Rum, or the Sea of the Romans, the Mediterranean. And it is this control that allows later campaigns by Muslims to go ahead and for Muslim Europe to really begin. One of the islands that Muawiyah briefly takes from the Byzantines with that very first Muslim navy is the island that was known to the Muslims as Sicilia. And although the presence is brief, it is a significant one because several members of the first 3 generations are also martyred in Sicilia. Al-Harawi tells us that just like in Cyprus, these burial sites once again became sites of ziyarah for the early Muslims, with the most important on the island of Sicilia becoming the one he claims belongs to an Aisha, who is a niece of the Prophet. Aisha, says Al-Harawi, was buried, like Haram, in a tomb near a mosque in the west of the town of Atrabash, modern-day Trapani. These sites became very popular during the period of the Emirate of Sicilia, which is established around 827, first by the Aghlabids with the help of the Umayyads of Al-Andalus, and later under the Kalbids, during which we see the most glorious Muslim period on the island. Sadly, though, almost nothing of real note survives from Sicily's Muslim period, except for the odd echo, like the design of these churches with its dome and geometric patterns, and this pillar still featuring Quranic inscriptions outside the great cathedral of Palermo, which was once the great mosque of Palermo, and where Ibn Jubair was amongst the last to pray. Given this paucity of Muslim remnants, what I want to focus on for my Sicilian and Maltese leg in this talk is the equally fascinating period that followed the Muslim one, when effectively Vikings, or Normans, just like those that were coming to invade Britain at around the same time, rocked up in Sicily, saw this marvelous culture under the Kalbids, and basically went native. Here you have what might feel a bit familiar to those of us that have ever visited the Tower of London. This is a palace known today as Lazisa. But when those Normans completed it, they called it Al-Aziz. This is because they became almost entirely Arabized, in that they spoke Arabic, called themselves sultans, retained Muslim staff, and even built Muslim-style palaces like the Al-Aziz, which combines external Norman features with internal Islamic ones. This included an advanced air conditioning system that still works today, which brought water into the building using channels and fountains that cooled air as it entered before distributing it throughout the building using clever wind tunnels. The interior also featured Muslim architectural ones like Muqarnas and Arabic inscriptions, where the builder of Al-Aziz, King William II, refers to himself as Sultan Musta'iz. That was not all. Outside his Al-Aziz, Sultan Musta'iz built himself a garden called Jannat al-Ard, or heaven on earth. Again, modeled on the Islamic concept of gardens in the heavens. The reason I wanted to focus on this, for this talk at least, more on this period, is because of the role it plays in seeding the later Christian Renaissance. We often hear about the translation efforts in Toledo, in Spain, that allowed Muslim knowledge to enter Christian Iberia, but we almost never hear about the role played by Palermo, where these Norman sultans also carried out huge translation projects, often using translators that had worked across Spain and Italy in places like Toledo and Bologna. This, of course, is a huge topic, explored more thoroughly in the book, so you are going to have to buy it, I'm afraid. But for now, I want to highlight one of the most fascinating things I learned when looking at this crucial phase of knowledge transference. As I tried to understand how the continuum from Muslim foundational knowledge in Europe to the Christian Renaissance was broken, I began to see more and more examples of what can only be described as plagiarism by some of Europe's much lauded Renaissance men. something we are only really starting to whisper about now. The example I use in my book is that of the 16th century scientist Nicolaus Copernicus, who has long been credited with telling us that actually the Earth rotates around the sun, and not the other way round as the Ptolemaic model suggested. That was up until the 1950s, when an Austro-American scholar, Otto Neubauer, and his colleagues came across the works of the late 14th century Syrian astronomer and timekeeper at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Ibn al-Shatir, whose lunar model, Neubauer realized, was identical to that of Copernicus. Only the Syrian had lived a century before the pole. Neubauer and his colleagues went on to also discover near identical parallels with Copernicus's work on planetary movements and that of the 13th century Persian polymath Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Neither Ibn al-Shatir nor al-Tusi were mentioned by Copernicus. Neubauer and his colleagues concluded that the likelihood of Copernicus independently coming up with these same ideas was all but impossible. Whether or not this negligence on Copernicus's part was deliberate or not, we'll never know, because he does name other Muslim authors. So it's quite possible that the translations he was relying on hadn't credited those individuals. But somewhere along the line, the continuum is broken. The other aspect of this history that I try to draw attention to in my book is the much overlooked relationship between the two medieval Norman dynasties. The reason this looks so familiar to the early one is, of course, this is the Norman Tower built in this country. And the relationship I'm talking about is that of the Normans of Sicily and the Normans of England, and the fact that through marriage and various cultural exchanges, these two families were remarkably closer than we might have assumed. And as a result, it is almost certain that some of the Islamic culture inherited by the Christian sultans in Sicily and in Spain made its way to these shores. In the book, one of the examples I discuss is that of the Norman King Henry II, whose daughter, Joan of England, just happens to be married to the aforementioned Sultan Musta'iz, William II. Henry also married another of his daughters, Eleanor of England, to Alfonso VIII of Castile in Spain. Both of these kingdoms are known to have absorbed much of the Islamic culture they had inherited, including Islamic legal, fiscal, and architectural practices, as well as the intellectual traditions in science, medicine, and philosophy through their two respective translation centers, Palermo and Toledo. The familial ties meant clear channels of exchange existed between England and these centers in both Spain and Sicily. In fact, the more I looked into Henry II, the more interesting things became. For example, Henry's tutor was one Adelard of Bath, often regarded as England's first great scientist. Adelard, it turns out, had traveled extensively through Muslim Spain, Sicily, and maybe even further east in search of the studies of the Arabs. In all likelihood, he understood Arabic and is often credited with introducing the Arabic numerals to the British Isles. Scholars like Adelard are believed to have often moved between England, Sicily, and Spain, and with them certain ideas and practices, some of which are believed to have affected, amongst other things, English common law, the framework of which Henry II established towards the end of his life. There are several features in English common law that scholars point to as potentially having arrived from Muslim legal practices. But probably the most fascinating is Henry's institutionalizing of a 12-man jury system to uncover the truth. This bears more than a striking resemblance to the Lafif in Islamic Maliki jurisprudence. The Lafif, which was developed between the 8th and 11th centuries within the Maliki legal system, requires 12 members of the community to swear by God to tell the truth as they analyze the facts of a case before arriving at a unanimous verdict. As many of you know, the Maliki school is one of the 4 main Islamic Sunni schools of theology. But what is interesting about this is that it is the Maliki school of theology that was most widely observed in both Muslim Sicily and Muslim Spain. After Sicily, I headed to Malta, which was originally a part of the Emirate of Sicilia. And although, like Sicily, physical remnants of the Emirate are scarce, I went there because it is home to the greatest intangible remnant of the Emirate, its language. You see, the Maltese speak a language that is predominantly made up of an ancient form of European Arabic, known today as Siculo Arabic, a highly beautified version of which you can see on this gravestone of a Maltese Muslim woman known as Maimuna. Maltese is therefore the only Semitic language that is an official language of the European Union, and one of the only places in the world where an ancient European Arabic is still spoken. The other is Tunisia. And such is the common ground between the two that it is said Tunisians and the Maltese can more or less understand each other when speaking in their own native tongues. When it comes to numbers, for example, it's basically Arabic. Wahid, Itnin, Talata, Arba. It is also the reason why the island's Christian fasting festival of Lent is called Ramadan. And the word for Easter is Eid, like Eid. Now there's another picture there, which is very different to the ones I've shown you so far. What you're looking at is a young archaeologist standing in a trench. And being the nosy historian that I am, as we were approaching this museum, which is just to the left of the young archaeologist, we obviously wanted to know what they were digging up here. And the answer really threw me, because she said, "We're looking for a mass grave." And as you can imagine, I panicked. I thought, I've missed some kind of genocide in Malta here, because there's mass graves somewhere. She made it worse, because I asked what kind of mass grave. And she said, a Muslim mass grave. And it got really scary for me, because I thought, my God, I really haven't done my research. Muslims have been murdered en masse in Malta, and I don't know about it. But actually, the mass grave wasn't how the Muslims were buried. The museum that I was going to see is dedicated to the Roman remnants found in this particular part of Malta, known as Rabat, very close to a square called Mesquita. And the museum sat right next to a huge Islamic cemetery, which is why I was visiting it with my colleagues. But what had happened was, during the 19th century, when across Europe they were desperate to create some kind of link to the ancient Greco-Roman culture that they deemed to be greater than any other, they discovered a Roman mural in the ground. Now, those of you that understand time will know the Roman mural comes after the Muslim period in Malta. And so in order to get to that, the great archaeologists of the time simply flung everything else into a mass grave. And that's how we have a mass Muslim grave, which tells you about the serious lack of respect when it comes to a lot of the Islamic heritage in the ground. After Malta, I went to Portugal, which was known as Algarve al-Andalus, from which we have the modern name for the south of Portugal, the Algarve. The main reason I wanted to go to Portugal was to find this church, Our Lady of the Annunciation in the town of Murtala, because it was reportedly where Christians once prayed towards Makkah. Up until the 1940s, it had been assumed that this had always been a church. And then workmen removing an old wooden altar found this behind it, confirming that behind the altar there had once been a mihrab, and the church had begun life as a mosque. This then led to further research into the archives, and that's when the most fascinating story of religious transition emerges. The story goes that when the Muslim period came to an end and the mosque was converted into a church and the locals became Christians, be it by choice or otherwise, they just weren't happy with the direction they were being asked to pray in, the new direction, and insisted the altar be placed in the original direction they used to pray in, towards Makkah. Although the sources that my guide was referring to back then says they wanted to place it in the direction of the Quran, which I think may have been a mistranslation from Qibla. They actually petitioned the king because the local governors wouldn't let them do this. And when they petitioned the king to make the change, he granted it. And my guide said it was because, although they had become Christians, they still wanted to pray towards the direction they had always prayed in. Today, the church, the only confirmed former mosque space in Portugal, is part of a series of spaces that make up the Islamic Museum of Murtala, an initiative that was established in Murtala upon the town's rediscovery of its Islamic heritage. And I wanted to talk about this work because it offers hope, because the journey was pretty dark otherwise. This is one of the only heritage projects I came across where the non-Muslims are trying to own and embrace their own Muslim history. And here we see one of the leading archaeologists of the project and my guide, Manuel de Pasinas. Here he is admiring a water vessel from the Muslim period that took him almost 15 years to piece together. While the initiative, which also involves a biannual Islamic festival in the town, still has much work to do, I wanted to highlight Manuel and his work as one of the few glimmers of hope on this journey, and a model of how non-Muslims in Europe might go about reconnecting with their Muslim heritage. Something he said was made difficult for two key reasons: aggressive anti-Muslim governments in the past, and arguably in the present, that reinforced the othering of Portugal's Muslim past, and, just like in Malta, the destruction of Portugal's Muslim heritage in the ground. As an archaeologist, Manuel claimed he came across evidence time and again that the Muslim phase in the ground was rarely respected or preserved by archaeologists of the past. But he hoped that was now changing. And when he said this, he used the word Oshallah, which, had he been Muslim, would have been Inshallah, the word from which it evolved. And now to Spain, or Al-Andalus, where incidentally, when you hope for something, the word is Ojalá. Given the growing interest in the Muslim heritage of Spain, which easily has some of the greatest surviving monuments from historic Muslim Europe, I'm going to focus less on what the glories of that period involved and how revolutionary it was to the emergence of modern Europe. I'm sure there's plenty of reels on social media that will tell you that. Now, what I have up here is not a mosque, in case you were wondering. I'm sure my caption has given it away. But it's actually a synagogue over there on the right. Because what I want to focus on is how different some of the traditional narratives look when viewed through Muslim and Jewish sources, especially the Jewish experience in Muslim Iberia. And I want to start with the arrival of Muslims in Iberia. Everyone knows the classic tale, I'm sure, of Tharik ibn Ziyad in 711, arriving with what's often described almost like a band of, misfits, merry men, and everyone marvels, how did this little motley crew of people take this huge expanse, this huge peninsula in such a short space of time? Well, according to historians like al-Makkari, this is because they had help. You see, not only do Jewish and Muslim sources claim that they were invited by the Iberian Jews who were experiencing horrific conditions under the Visigoths, Makkari tells us every time a city was taken, be it Cordoba, Seville, Toledo, Granada, what Tharik ibn Ziyad and his men could do is they could leave the Jews in charge and go to the next one. This is why such a tiny army was able to take such a huge peninsula, because they didn't take it by themselves. They had inside help. They were collaborating with the local Jews, who were an oppressed people of the peninsula. And when you put it like that, it almost sounds like a liberation, doesn't it? As if they'd come to liberate people. You know, the way we did in Afghanistan and Iraq. Whether you agree with that or not, what is undeniable is that the situation of the Jews improved so dramatically, they experienced not one, but according to some, 2 golden ages. Spanning roughly the 10th to the 12th centuries, it is often split into 2 distinct zeniths. The first was during the Caliphate of Cordoba, which produced luminous polymaths like Hasdai ibn Shaprut, Rabbi Musa ibn Maimun or Maimonides, the Aristotelian philosopher and physician Judah Halevi, Neoplatonic philosopher and poet Solomon ibn Gabirol. The second zenith is under the Zirid and Nasrid rulers of Granada, when figures such as Samuel ibn Nagrila, who served as both a vizier and a military commander, and his son Joseph ibn Nagrila, not only held high political positions, but also contributed to the vibrancy of Jewish scholarly and literary life. It is during this period that the foundations are laid for the eventual revival of Hebrew as a living language, during the Muslim European period. This is the period that births poetry and music and a cultural flourishing that has been unmatched since in the Jewish tradition. What is truly sad is that this fascinating co-flourishing, not tolerance, because that's a horrible word, it suggests we're just putting up with each other. They were flourishing, is at best underplayed and at worst dismissed by popular historians, which has the following truly dangerous effects, especially given what we are witnessing around the world today. Firstly, it reinforces the nonsense of a Judeo-Christian dominant cultural identity. And this really upsets me, this Judeo-Christian nonsense, because anybody who's had a fleeting look at Europe's history will know that there was never a cozy alliance between the Jews and the Christians. The European Christians, the historic ones, just so we don't offend any modern Christians, the historic European Christians consistently tried to erase the Jews over and over again. And every time they did, they found sanctuary in Muslim Europe. It also denies Muslim Europe the credit it is due for having effectively been the guardians of what was then Europe's most persecuted religious group for almost 12 centuries. An aspect of European history that by leaving it out, it continues to galvanize those who have become very, very confident at the moment, pushing a narrative of Jews and Muslims as eternal enemies, which, as we all know, prior to the 20th century is a complete and utter nonsense, not just in Europe, but across the globe. The second thing I wish to highlight in this talk about Spain is the role of the reconquest narrative and the mythologies that galvanized it. These are mythologies and legends that became central to the modern Spanish identity, and which I believe are symptomatic of the kinds of narratives and myths we find across Europe that have contributed to what I have described, a little bit controversially, in my book, as an anti-Muslim DNA running through the core of the modern popular European identity. The two myths and narratives are that of the patron saint of Spain, St. James, and the legend of the tribute of 100 virgins. In medieval Iberian legend, St. James, who for those of you that don't know, was actually a real person that was a companion of the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, just to put that into perspective. But in medieval Iberian legend, long after his death, St. James becomes Matamoros. Anybody in here understand Spanish? Matamoros means Moor slayer, which means Muslim killer. So just have a think about that. The patron saint of the country is called Muslim killer. And this is in reference to the mythic image of St. James miraculously appearing at the made-up Battle of Clavio, traditionally dated to 844, but it never happened, to help Christian forces defeat the Muslim army of Al-Andalus. Closely tied to this is the 100 Virgin tribute, a later Romance-era story claiming that the Christians of Iberia were forced every year to send 100 maidens virgin each year to the Muslim rulers, and that the battle, aided by St. James, ends this humiliation. Neither episode is supported by contemporary evidence. Both emerged centuries later as powerful symbols used to dramatize Christian resistance, justify the Reconquista, and become central to what became the Spanish identity. As for those of you that had come in the hope of hearing how the great scholars, artists, and teachers of Muslim Europe revolutionized Europe, I'm afraid, again, you will have to buy the book and read it. Don't just buy it and use it as a doorstop. I know it looks like one. But to offer you a somewhat romanticized window of it all, I will end by reading the words of the 19th century author Victor Robinson. You'll notice his name isn't Muslim, which also tells you that many Europeans who weren't Muslim knew exactly how glorious this was. He writes in his Story of Medicine, Europe was darkened at sunset. Cordova shone with public lamps. Europe was dirty. Cordova built 1,000 baths. Europe was covered with vermin. Cordova changed its undergarment daily. Europe lay in mud. Cordova's streets were paved. Europe's palaces had smoke holes in the ceiling. Cordova's arabesques were exquisite. Europe's nobility could not sign its name. Cordova's children went to school. Europe's monks could not read the baptismal service. Cordova's teachers created a library of Alexandrian dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions if there are any.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for that. That was really fascinating. A quick question about the sources that you used. Before you started the book, I'm assuming there was a period of research. What were your sources? Were they European sources or Arab sources in terms of what you thought you'd find along the way?
So as I explained, my methodological, it's a horrible word, methodological approach generally is to rely on Islamic sources. I'm consciously being subjective. You see, one of the myths that we've been led to believe up until now is that when a white male person writes these histories, he is somehow being objective. And the fact that he is not Muslim is apparently It's really significant because then, he's removed from it. He doesn't have any emotional investment. And of course, anybody who's studied philosophy or has looked into the idea of objectivity, it doesn't exist. Nobody can be objective. It's impossible. All the philosophers have confirmed this, because to be objective, you would have to extinguish yourself. And I'm not talking about it in the Sufi sense. So you cannot be objective. The difference is if you pretend that you're objective and people believe you, then of course you have the upper hand. Because then when a Muslim comes and writes about Muslim history, oh, he's being biased. So I'm being subjective, but I'm letting the evidence speak for itself. I'm not making stuff up. I'm not lying. I'm not being biased. But I'm not going to pretend I'm being objective, because that doesn't exist. So by using to come back to your point, by using the Muslim sources, you see what happens is immediately the Muslim history of Europe is no longer the other history. It's their history. And this with my first book, I make this a bit more apparent because I focus a lot on Evliya Çelebi, who is an Ottoman traveller whose work I use in the first book. In this one, I use several sources, but a comparable one will be Ibn Jubair when I'm in Sicily. So when I'm in Sicily, I use Ibn Jubair's lens a lot. And Ibn Jubair actually arrives after the Muslim period. So it's really interesting having a Muslim of Muslim Spain come and see the Arab Normans and talk about them in positive ways, but also in negative ways. But the point I'm making is, when a historic Muslim is writing about Muslim Europe, they're not talking about a foreign invasion. It's the most normalized thing there is. It's a bit like a Bosnian talking about being European today. It's not a foreign thing at all. It's not a strange thing. Myself and the uncle were speaking earlier. It's not a strange thing at all. To them, there's no conflict in being European. And so it's the same when you look at it through these sources. So suddenly we're not talking about these people as being invaders. We're not talking about it being an invasive presence 800 years later, which is what you see with some of the other sources.
Okay. Just as a follow-up, what language are you finding these sources in?
I'm accessing them primarily in English.
In English?
Yeah, because I don't have the Arabic capacity to go directly to the primary sources.
Where are these sources placed? Are they
Loads of them on the internet.
Okay.
A lot of them are freely available. Like At-Tabari's entire history is completely freely available. You can download it. I'm not saying that mentions Europe a lot, but it certainly tells you a bit about the Qubrus experience, and in fact that's where I took the name Qubrus from, At-Tabari's history. And a lot of these translations were of course originally done by some of the Orientalists that I'm also criticizing, but you have to start somewhere. And unfortunately, because I'm not in a position to go and access a lot of the Arabic sources firsthand, inshallah one day someone who will come and build on this. But if I was to spend my whole time paralyzed by the fear of not doing a good job, like many people have in the past, we wouldn't even start. So I know the work isn't perfect. I know it has many errors. I mean, we know every book has errors except the only book. But what I'm saying is, by shifting the perspective, you get a very different take on Europe. Yes. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, brother, for
Thank you.
The information you provided us. My question may seem a little bit strange.
Okay.
To link what you have said to the present, can you estimate what is the percentage of European people who actually know about these facts?
Estimate? Wow.
Yeah, an estimate, of course. It is a rough estimate, actually.
Well, put it this way. Every time I've given a talk, very few people, if any, know all of the history I'm talking about. Some will know about the Spanish experience. I mean, a lot of people know about the Spanish experience now because, we have Instagram and what have you, and people are going there and marveling at it, and some people are actually reading about it. But we don't know it the way we should. So another aspect of this, coming back to what we were talking about just now, is you will go to, for example, the Alhambra, and I cover the Alhambra in my book in a very specific way. And when you read the Alhambra through the guides there, or through the audio guide, you will get a very Eurocentric perspective of an amazing building. And what's really, really sad is this building, through the European projections of people like Washington Irvine, who famously wrote the Tales of Alhambra, they have turned this into, quote unquote, no, there's children around, so I won't use that word, a pleasure palace. Okay? Essentially, where as you walk around, you're supposed to imagine the women giggling in the harems, and you're supposed to see Ba Abdul chasing the guy who's sleeping with his wife. This is the kind of narrative that are projected onto this. This is a building the Nazrid bit, not the Christian bit, the Nazrid bit. This is a building that has so many ayats of the Quran plastered all over the world. And it has the Nazrid motto, which is about reverence and fear of Allah, over and over again repeated on the walls, including the incantations we use on a daily basis, like Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, all over the walls. And you're telling me this is what went on? The vast majority, if not all of the all of the documentation that tells us what happened in the Muslim period don't exist no more. The only thing that has existed from that period that tells us of an incident that took place inside the Alhambra during the Muslim period that we know for a fact was a Mawlid. This is the only one we have any factual evidence of something taking place in the court of the, I think in Spanish, the Court de Leones, you know, the Court of the Lions, the famous, so just before that is built, they have a Mawlid there. This is what went on. I didn't even know until my third visit that the Alhambra had a mosque. This is how these things, so even when we think we know this history, we don't know it because we're being told it, or it's been canonized as this is the perspective. And that perspective is usually a Eurocentric one that sees it as exotic, foreign, you know, overtly, again, I'm conscious of children being here, but, you know, presenting Muslims in a particular way, which, if you read the Daily Mail, is done every day anyway.
So in that case, apart from the research work that you've done, the object of this is to educate Muslim people about, you know, their history.
No, it's to educate Europeans about their history.
To educate whom?
Europeans.
European as well.
This is European history. It's not Muslim history. It's European history. It's European history. It's their history, and the problem they have is embracing it as theirs. These were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims. They were red-haired sultans. They were not like, you know, some foreigner. After 800 years in Spain, they weren't foreigners. The Spaniards, the Muslims of Spain, in fact, the Muslims of Bosnia are more European than white people are American. But it's about who tells the story. That's why you've never heard that phrase, have you? You've never heard that. You've never heard somebody question whether white people are American or not. And they've only been American for about 200-300 years, maybe a little bit longer. Bosnians have been European. Well, Bosnians have always been European. Bosnians have been Muslim for about 6 centuries. And still, because they're Muslim, they're not considered European. So the education isn't just about, oh, we know some interesting things, so now we can talk about it. The education is understanding why and what impact that has had on us. And that's going to take a long time.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Thank you, Iqbal.
Thank you, Tharik, for that very interesting. Just before I put my question,
yes,
you know, in the Alhambra, in the tourist guides, it says General Ife.
Yeah, of course.
Well,
yeah.
If you read it, General Arifin, you understand what
exactly.
it is talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of things like
that.
Yeah,
there's a lot of things, and even the things with a lot of the Muslim scholars that are cited in the sources, their names have been Latinized. You know, Ibn Sina is Avicenna. You know, Ibn Rushd is Averroes, and all of this. So, whether or not that's a conscious decision to de-Islamize them or not, I don't know, because it's impossible sometimes to know. But clearly, we can see the impact it's had. People don't even know they're Muslim.
So my question is this. You know, historically, the Christians have been anti-Jewish.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're coming from the Inquisition up to the Holocaust.
Oh, way before, even before Muslims came.
Yeah.
As soon as the Christians came to Europe, pretty much straight away they wanted to get rid of the Jews.
And
it's an accepted fact.
As you mentioned, all the time, Muslims have been offering a protective umbrella.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say they didn't just offer protection to the Jews. They offered it to the minority sects of the Christians as well, and various other religious beliefs as well. Now, I'm talking about the Jews just because they were the largest group.
Now, my question is, how did they manage to convert this anti-Jewish Christian sentiment into anti-Muslim with the collaboration of some of the Zionists?
Right.
This is my worry. Because that's, the Judeo-Christian is that essentially what it is talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated question. I don't think I'm qualified to answer it, strictly speaking. But what I can say is, obviously, I make this bold claim that, you know, Europe has an anti-Muslim DNA. And some of my friends have said, oh, I think the DNA is too strong. Well, it's only too strong if you don't understand how the concept of Europe came about. And the concept of Europe emerges actually out of medieval Christendom. Now, that's a form of European Christianity to an extent, okay, or at least the coming together of various kingdoms under the flag of Christianity, specifically to fight Islam. So the very birth of what we now know as the European identity begins in that moment, when people like Charlemagne become the Holy Roman Emperor. At this moment in time, the kingdoms that come together have come together for one purpose: to fight Islam. So the birth of that identity, the DNA there, is anti-Muslim at its core. And then we see it being nurtured through things like the Crusade narratives. Then we see it in the Reconquest. Then we see it during the anti-Ottoman things. I'm at the moment researching some stuff on Venice, for example, and I was looking into, there's the oldest surviving printed Quran in the world, as far as we know, is hidden away in Venice. I'm not going to tell you where, because you're going to have to buy that book as well. But it's, when I went to interview the Guardians, I've got to make money somehow, guys, you know. When I went to interview the Guardians of that particular Quran, they were terrified of anybody knowing where it is, because they believed that it was printed by local Venetians, because the Venetians were very entrepreneurial, as you know. They were traders, great traders. And by the way, their biggest customer were the Ottomans. They believed that this Quran may have been printed originally to sell to the Ottomans, because, you know, there was a great market there. And then they believed that what happened is that the furious Ottoman sultans, who were very anti-progress, burnt all the other copies and chopped off the hands of the people who did this. And I was like, wow, this is really powerful stuff. I looked into it, it's completely made up. But these people, they believe it. And so these are examples of the legends, and obviously I gave you a very extreme legend, a very, very big one. You're not going to get, and I don't think there is another European country whose patron saint for hundreds of years was known as Muslim killer. I mean, that's the extreme. It's not going to get worse than that. But the point I was making, in every single corner of Europe, you will find these kind of narratives. You will find these legends. You will find them over and over again repeated. And they were, this is what, they weren't just repeated in the picture. Where was it? Sorry. So they weren't just repeated. If you look there, oh no, I'm on the screen. Sorry.
That's okay. We'll just get that.
Yeah.
Again.
If you look there, you will see a poster of a 19th century play that was still repeating the tribute of the virgins. So these weren't just things that, you know, it was the social media of the day. Okay? You went to church and you would see the Muslim killer there. Every single church in Spain had a statue. If you go to Cordoba's Mezquita now, you will see it inside there. This was the propaganda of the day. So this is how the DNA was nurtured. Even in this country, we had plays about Muhammad. I'm sure anybody who's looked into this knows this, where the Prophet was depicted in the most horrific ways. And the early Muslims, you know, including Abdullah Quilliam and others, actually protested against this. So this wasn't just something that happened far away. The pan-European identity, the popular one, the one in the west of Europe, which is why it rejects the east of Europe, because of course the east of Europe has indigenous Muslims. If you accept the east of Europe as part of the European identity, you have to accept that Muslims are European as well. Now, the reason it rejects it is because this identity was birthed in the west of Europe. This is where the popular European identity is born and then continues to evolve and is reinforced to this day.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but I can see there are quite a few questions. Just put your hand up if you have a question still. Fine. Can we take 2 or 3 as a group, and then we can try and answer them together, and then we'll probably end there, if that's okay. Yeah. Do you want to start here?
I'm also conscious that some people did buy a book and probably want me to sign something, so
sure.
just leave a little bit of
time. We'll try and finish in 5-10 minutes.
Thank you very much for this. Really, really
Thank
good. On the question of the 100 virgins who are sent out, to what extent can it, or is it legitimate to see that as today's narrative about Muslim grooming gangs as an extension? Okay.
That's exactly what the reason I picked those two, again, I'm on the screen, sorry. The reason I picked those two narratives, right? And obviously, you know, because of the children here, I don't want to go into too much graphic detail, but one depicts Muslims as being barbaric and only worthy of being killed. In other words, subhuman, and we've seen that over the last 2 years, okay? And the other one depicts us as being salacious and, okay? In other words, we have a lust. And this is basically a Daily Mail headline every day. So the anti-Muslim DNA, these are the perceptions that have been created of Muslims across Europe. And they are repeated on a daily basis across Europe, in the papers. You know, this is what is going on in the unconscious. And so until we undo that, until we recognize this as a problem, in my opinion, you know, Europe will never accept its Muslims until it acknowledges that it is anti-Muslim by default. And then only then can you examine that. And, you know, I sometimes when I'm talking about this, sorry, I know sometimes when I'm talking to non-Muslims about this, I point out that this even affects some of us. Because we were brought up in this. And so some of us also have a little bit of that anti-Muslimness in us, even if we don't always understand it at first. And it might be just towards other Muslims. It might be towards Muslims who look a particular way. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we feel that way? Because we are also brought up in this environment. This is where we've been educated. These are the sources we've used for our education as well. Yes.
Thank you. We'll take one final question, I think, from Omar.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
Thank you very much for changing the lens in this.
Oh, thank you.
I had two very brief questions.
Sure. They're never brief when they start like that.
When I was last in Seville,
right,
I went to the Giralda and then opposite it, the palace, the old palace.
Alcazar.
The Alcazar.
Yeah.
And it is decorated in a Nasrid style.
Yep.
Where at the Alhamra you have La Ghalib Allah. Here it is Al-Izzu wal-Mawla li Sultan Pedro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it also has the Nasrid motto as well, above one of the gates.
Which in itself is interesting in the collaboration between these two powers.
Yep.
And the possibility here, with a resurgent Catholic Church at that point in time, of a convivencia.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps the history of Muslims as being the eternal other, institutionalized in the Inquisition.
And the Jews at the time.
And focused through the Crusades is not an inevitability on that side. And I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think convivencia was very difficult after a period of time because of how aggressive the Catholic Church became. You know, even during Pedro's period, and of course Pedro's called the cruel, he's called the just, he's called all kinds of things purely because he did try to engage with the Nasrids were his great allies for long periods, and in fact there is a strong suggestion that the Alcázar, the parts of the Alcázar that were built during Pedro's time were built probably by the same artisans who worked on the Alhambra. And we can see the, you know, the craftsmanship. And in many ways, if you want to appreciate what the Alhambra really looked like, you need to go to the Alcázar because that was preserved. Whereas the Alcázar was stripped of all the color and is created in some kind of neoclassical look where it's all white now, which is really bizarre because Muslims love color. And so if you go to the Alcázar, you'll see what it's really supposed to look like. But yeah, convivencia became very, very difficult after the Caliphate period. Even when Alfonso tried to preserve it in Toledo, he was known as the king of the free faiths. It was minimal. The Arab Normans tried to do it in Sicily, minimal, because the church was so aggressive, and the church made no. This was the big difference. When people talk about Christianity and Islam fought in Europe, the difference was Islam would allow others to live. Christianity had no room for anybody else. Sorry, medieval Christianity. Okay, we have a very different Christianity today. So medieval European Christianity, it was my way or the highway, and that was the big problem.
And does that explain the success of Muslim communities developing in the Balkans and Spain because of the intransigence and intolerance of the church and preceding monotheistic traditions like the Bogomils?
Right.
And even amongst the Visigoths in Spain, does that lay the seeds then for widespread acceptance of Islam?
Wow. That's a very complicated question, but I think clearly, you know, there are various reasons, okay? Clearly, the Islamic system was designed to encourage conversion. Okay, so if you lived amongst the Muslims, you would have to pay tax. The tax would be lowered if you converted. You know, there were lots of benefits to it, but nobody said you had to convert. And I think that pragmatic approach was definitely far more appealing. And of course, long into the Muslim Empire, in fact, early on. This is a great way of making the point. Early on, when the Muslim Empire was so expansive, it was actually the largest Christian empire in the world, because the vast majority of people were still Christian. There was no compulsion to convert anybody. And the leaders loved it because it filled their tax coffers. So they didn't actually want, some leaders didn't want these people to convert because it made more money for them. So there was never really a coercive attempt en masse. Of course, there were, various little examples here and there, but there was never a coercive attempt en masse. And like I say, early on, when they expanded from, as far east to as far west, it was the largest Christian empire in the world still.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there. Muhammad wa ala Muhammad salawat. As you already know, there's a stall over here where Tharik will be able to sign a book if you'd like to purchase one as well. That's available over there as well as his previous book, which is Minarets in Mountains. Brothers and sisters, just to let you know about our upcoming programs, next week we have Dr. Ali Al-Hilli, who will be speaking to us on the event of Isra and Miraj, and our regular programs continue through the week, including our exercise classes for ladies on Mondays and Tuesdays. We have karate and taekwondo on Wednesdays. We have a Dua Kamal and Surah Yasin program on Thursdays, our regular Salam talks on Fridays, tuition and madrasa on the weekend as well, and Soul Kitchen taking place as well. Brothers and sisters, we have, at the moment, you probably have seen on the outside that the kitchen area is being refurbished. The cost of that is approximately £40,000. Please do make a donation towards the cost so we're able to run our regular Ramadan programs, etc., using the new facility. Thank you very much.